On a crisp autumn morning in the middle of October 1944, something remarkable happened at the Norfolk Naval Base that would forever change how a group of German women understood the war they'd been fighting. The date was the 12th, and as the SS Bremen settled into her mooring after weeks crossing the Atlantic, 47 women who'd been captured across occupied France, Belgium, and what remained of the crumbling Third Reich stood on deck, pulling their threadbare coats tight against the cold wind blowing in from the ocean. Everything they'd been told by their officers, everything Nazi propaganda had drilled into their heads, painted America as a nation of soft people living in comfort, utterly incapable of waging real war. The moment that Gangplank touched American soil, their entire worldview began to crack apart. The noise hit them first, an overwhelming symphony of industrial power. Hammers striking steel hull plates rang out in steady, rhythmic patterns that echoed like massive bells across the waterfront. The sound never stopped, just kept going with mechanical precision. Diesel engines rumbled and spat thick black smoke, while enormous cranes hoisted cargo containers the size of small houses onto waiting railroad cars. The smells came next. An overpowering mixture of hot tar, thick grease, burning steel, and salt water that made their eyes water. For women who'd spent years living with rationing and scarcity, watching every resource carefully measured and distributed, this sensory assault of pure abundance knocked them off balance. One among them, a woman called Ingrid, would later write in her personal diary about that first moment. Her words captured the shock perfectly. She'd expected to see emptiness, perhaps some evidence of the struggling nation their propaganda had described. Instead, what spread before her eyes was a harbor packed with more warships than Hamburg had ever held, even in its glory days. The contradiction couldn't have been more stark or more impossible to ignore. These weren't just random women either. They were trained technicians, skilled auxiliaries, people who understood logistics and production. They'd anticipated finding a society that was hollow at its core. What surrounded them, before they'd even stepped onto American ground, was evidence of a war machine operating at a scale that defied everything they thought they knew. The Norfolk shipyard alone kept more than 40,000 men and women employed around the clock, and they were launching a complete Liberty ship every 4 days without fail. By the time the war finally ended, American shipyards would have constructed 2,710 of these vessels. That single number dwarfed Germany's entire wartime ship production combined. A young Navy lieutenant approached them, his manner formal but notably absent of hostility, speaking with a quiet civility that somehow made them even more uneasy than threats would have. The women's boots clattered against the wooden dock as they descended, their eyes darting constantly between rows of American soldiers standing at ease and the endless backdrop of cranes, cargo nets, and partially built vessels stretching toward the horizon. The silence among the German prisoners felt heavy, broken only by the shuffle of their feet and the constant rhythmic slamming of shipyard machinery working in the background. For the Americans going about their daily work, this was just another routine day. For the captured women, it felt like a revelation that turned their understanding of the world upside down. The very atmosphere seemed charged with constant movement and overwhelming power. They couldn't help but notice small details that told larger stories. A long convoy of military trucks sat idling nearby, their fuel tanks full, their canvas covers new and unstained. Pallets stacked waist-high held fresh uniforms in neat bundles. These women came from a nation that had been rationing basic soap and sugar since 1940, so these signs of casual, thoughtless plenty struck them like physical blows. One prisoner whispered under her breath in German, saying it wasn't possible, that this couldn't be real. Another woman clutched her thin scarf even tighter, as though she could somehow brace herself against something far more dangerous than the autumn chill cutting through the air. What they were seeing wasn't staged for their benefit, wasn't some carefully arranged tour designed to impress or intimidate captured enemies. This was simply how Americans lived during wartime, and that simple fact unsettled them more deeply than any propaganda film they'd ever been forced to watch back home. A Red Cross observer, present to make sure the prisoners received humane treatment according to international law, made a note that day about what he witnessed. He wrote that the women seemed genuinely disoriented, but not so much by the fact of their capture as by the nature of their arrival. The docks themselves appeared to have communicated a kind of power that went beyond mere military force. As guards guided the German women toward buses waiting to transport them inland, they caught one final glimpse of the horizon. Ship masts and industrial smokestacks stabbed upward into the grey sky like an iron forest, stretching as far as they could see. That image would burn itself into their memories permanently, but this initial shock represented only the beginning of their education. The journey inland would take them deeper into the industrial heartland of the United States, past evidence even more staggering than what they'd witnessed at the Norfolk docks. With every mile the buses traveled, the contradiction between what they'd been taught to believe and what they could see with their own eyes would grow sharper and more impossible to deny. The military convoy pulled away from Norfolk just after midday, flanked by a pair of jeeps for security. The buses themselves were painted that distinctive olive-drab color, rattling along the coastal highway, with windows still streaked from sea salt spray. Inside those buses, the German women sat wrapped in tense silence, but their eyes remained drawn irresistibly to the landscape rolling past outside. They'd expected scarcity and struggle. Instead, mile after mile revealed America as an arsenal that seemed to have no end. The first real shock came mere minutes after leaving the harbor area behind. Shipyards stretched for what looked like city blocks, with steam and smoke rising from construction gantries, where welders sent cascades of bright orange sparks tumbling through the grey afternoon air. Rows upon rows of Liberty ships stood in various stages of completion, some nothing more than exposed ribs and steel plates, others nearly ready for their launching ceremonies. A young signals officer among the prisoners, someone who'd actually studied naval tonnage tables and production statistics as part of her training, whispered in complete disbelief. She said one shipyard here contained more hulls under construction than existed in all of Kiel combined. The actual numbers supported her observation perfectly. Norfolk by itself produced dozens of destroyers, aircraft carriers, and auxiliary vessels throughout 1944. Across the entire nation, American yards were producing 18 million tons of shipping every single year, roughly 6 times Germany's complete wartime output from all sources. The rhythm of hammers and rivet guns echoed constantly through the bus windows, like an industrial heartbeat that never stopped pounding. As the convoy pushed further inland, the landscape transformed from docks to factories. Smokestacks punctuated the horizon in every direction. Warehouses sprawled across acres of land, their walls stenciled with company names the women only vaguely recognized from intercepted American documents they'd seen in intelligence briefings: Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One prisoner would later recall in an interview that it felt as though every town they passed was essentially a military barracks. Every street functioned as a supply line. That's when they realized their own newspapers had been feeding them lies for years. This wasn't some soft, distracted population more interested in movies and jazz music than fighting. This was a nation completely at war, but somehow doing it from a position of comfort. The paradox grew deeper and more troubling with every mile the buses covered. Even the roads themselves seemed to be part of this overwhelming revelation. Modern highways carried steady streams of trucks loaded down with wooden crates, military vehicles and spare parts. Gasoline, so desperately scarce in Germany that doctors had to ride bicycles to reach hospitals, flowed freely here, fueling a ceaseless motion of men and materials across vast distances. The women could smell it whenever the convoy slowed down, that sharp, sweet petroleum scent clinging to the warm autumn air. One of the American drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, actually chuckled when he overheard a prisoner gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks lined up nose to tail at a supply depot. He muttered under his breath, though loud enough to be heard, that this wasn't even half of what was moving on the roads at any given moment. For him, this represented the mundane and ordinary. For them, it was absolutely unthinkable. At a rest stop outside Newport News, the buses idled beside a massive rail yard. Long lines of boxcars and flatbed cars stood ready for loading, each one stamped with white chalk marks indicating their destinations: Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Giant cranes methodically loaded crates marked with serial numbers, and the sheer orderliness of the entire operation left the women feeling deeply unsettled. Back in the Reich, chaos had become the norm. Bombing raids constantly disrupted shipments, forcing people to improvise solutions. Shortages meant nothing ran on schedule anymore. Here, the logistics appeared clean, efficient, and absolutely relentless in their precision. The prisoners exchanged glances, silently taking stock of what they were witnessing. Several among them had been trained as analysts, their value to Berlin directly tied to their ability to assess production capacity from observed details. What they saw now, the frequency of train movements, the volume of materials being handled, the neat stockpiling of goods in organized warehouses, all suggested an enemy whose resources completely dwarfed their own nation's capabilities. One woman actually pulled out a small notebook and scribbled notes that were later recovered. She wrote that they'd thought America was fundamentally a land of consumers, people who bought things and wasted resources. Instead, it revealed itself as a land of producers, and every single factory they passed represented another nail being driven into Germany's coffin. Yet paradoxically, nobody was flaunting this abundance or showing off. American civilians along the route simply went about their normal lives. Workers wore coveralls and carried lunch pails. Children played games by the roadside. Women walked along carrying groceries in paper bags. There was no visible sense of strain or impending collapse, none of that hollow-eyed exhaustion that had come to define German cities throughout 1944. Instead, vitality seemed to spill directly from the streets themselves. The prisoners found they couldn't reconcile what they were seeing. Here was a nation waging global war on multiple continents, while still managing to feed its people adequately, still clothing them in decent fabric, still laying down new highways and building bridges as though peacetime had never really ended. By the time the convoy approached Richmond, the women had fallen completely silent. That initial shock at the harbour had gradually given way to something deeper, a gnawing realization that settled in their stomachs. What they'd witnessed in a single afternoon's drive surpassed what Germany could produce in an entire year of maximum effort. Their faith in propaganda, in the repeated assurances that America was soft, incapable, divided against itself, was dissolving like morning frost under the warm Virginia sun. But their journey hadn't finished yet. Ahead lay the prison camps themselves, the processing centers where, paradoxically, their captors would treat them with a level of dignity and care they absolutely had not expected to receive. And in that unexpected treatment, yet another revelation awaited them. The buses turned off the main highway as dusk began to settle, gravel crunching loudly under the tires as they approached a sprawling compound surrounded by barbed wire fencing. The women braced themselves mentally, expecting to find filth, severe overcrowding, and casual brutality. German propaganda had consistently painted American prisoner of war camps as little more than open cages where captured soldiers were left to suffer. But as the main gate swung open with a metallic screech, another paradox revealed itself in stark detail. The barracks that spread before them looked far more like a well-maintained college campus than any kind of prison. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in carefully planned lines, their roofs freshly tarred against the weather. Smoke curled gently from brick chimneys, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of fresh-baked bread wafting from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the residential barracks stretched tidy garden plots and an open field that had been marked out for recreational activities. One woman, a trained nurse named Hildegard, actually muttered aloud that it was impossible. She said these people lived better here than their own German soldiers did at the front lines. Inside the main processing center, the shock only deepened further. Each prisoner received an identification number, had her photograph taken for official records, and was issued clean bedding that smelled of soap. Then came the thorough medical inspection. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician with a brisk but professional manner, conducted examinations of each woman. She checked their teeth for decay, listened to their lungs with a stethoscope, and noted signs of malnutrition in nearly every single case. Through an interpreter, she told one prisoner directly that they'd clearly been living on approximately 1,200 calories per day, maybe even less. She added that American soldiers received twice that amount even when serving in active combat zones. For the German women, the contrast was almost humiliating in its clarity. Back home, rations had dwindled over the years to thin slices of dark black bread, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, and watery stews that barely qualified as food. Here in this American camp, even prisoners of war were being measured for properly fitting shoes and vaccinated against communicable diseases as a matter of routine procedure. Ingrid would later write in her journal that the Americans treated them like patients rather than enemies, and she found it both an insult to their pride and a mercy they hadn't earned. The paradox extended well beyond just food or medical care. That same evening, the women were led to their assigned barracks, where clean cots with heavy wool blankets awaited each of them. Bars of soap and fresh towels had been stacked in neat piles near the washroom entrance. A Red Cross representative took time to explain that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to basic human dignity as a matter of international law. The German women simply stared in complete disbelief. Their own government had signed those very same conventions. Yet Soviet and French prisoners held in camps throughout the Reich were literally starving in open fields without shelter. The numbers tell this story with brutal clarity. In American-run camps, German prisoners of war received an average of 3,500 calories in their daily rations, which was actually more than many American civilians received during rationing. In German camps, Allied prisoners often slowly starved on fewer than 1,000 calories per day. One prisoner confessed in a hushed tone to another that if the leadership back in Berlin ever knew the truth about how well they were surviving here, they would never forgive any of them. The sensory details of that first evening etched themselves permanently into memory. The smell of genuinely clean sheets, the taste of white bread served with real butter at supper, the pleasant clatter of stainless steel cutlery, all of these represented symbols of plenty that felt almost obscene. In one corner of the mess hall, a prisoner actually broke down crying after biting into a fresh orange, a fruit she hadn't seen since before the war began. She whispered to those around her that to them, this represented luxury beyond any reasonable expectation. Yet the treatment they received wasn't simple indulgence or kindness for its own sake. It was disciplined and purposeful. Guards maintained strict order firmly, and any attempt at escape would absolutely not be tolerated. But the basic civility itself functioned as its own kind of weapon, a subtle but powerful demonstration of American confidence. As one U.S. officer remarked to a colleague within earshot of some prisoners, they could afford to treat captives well because they weren't afraid of them. The women lay awake that first night in camp, listening to the low, steady hum of an electrical generator and the distant occasional bark of guard dogs. For some among them, it represented the first uninterrupted night of genuine rest they'd experienced in months. For others, it felt like torment of a different kind. Being shown basic humanity by the enemy made the Reich's systematic brutality harder to justify or excuse. But everything they'd witnessed so far, the overwhelming harbour, the endless highways, the surprisingly comfortable barracks, represented only the surface layer of America's true power. Soon, they would hear voices crackling across open radio channels and telephone lines, revealing something even more disorienting to their trained sensibilities. A war effort coordinated with a reach and efficiency that defied their imagination. The morning routine in camp began each day with roll call, a sharp bugle cutting through the cool autumn air. After breakfast, which consisted of scrambled eggs, toast, and hot coffee that tasted like pure luxury, the prisoners were escorted into a large common hall. There, for the first time, they heard something they'd been repeatedly told could not possibly exist. The open, unguarded pulse of American military communications. Radio sets hummed with constant activity, telephones rang frequently, and the steady clatter of typewriters filled every corner of the room. For women who'd been trained in signal work, radar operations, and military logistics, even the soundscape itself represented a revelation that challenged everything they understood. They leaned forward instinctively, their ears sharpening to catch every detail. Through the static crackling from a shortwave radio set came voices speaking in clipped, efficient English, weather updates originating from Kansas, shipping manifests being read out from New Orleans, naval traffic reports from vessels operating off the Pacific coast. What struck them as truly astonishing wasn't just the incredible breadth of information flowing through these channels, it was how utterly unguarded it all seemed. One of the Germans, a former radio operator named Lotta, whispered to those near her that they didn't even bother trying to hide anything. They broadcast openly to the entire world because they could afford to do so. Back in the Reich, secrecy governed absolutely everything. Communication lines were constantly monitored for security breaches. Codes were layered and cloaked in multiple encryptions. Paranoia governed every single transmission, no matter how minor. Here in America, the openness felt both confusing and genuinely terrifying in its implications. A U.S. Army sergeant noticed the women's rapt attention and explained casually, as though describing nothing particularly remarkable, that this represented just routine daily operations. He said they maintained thousands of radio stations, thousands of telephone lines, connecting every state, every military base, every ship at sea. The entire country stayed connected at all times. He simply shrugged, treating it as completely ordinary. But for the prisoners listening, it felt absolutely staggering. Germany's fragmented communication networks, already severely crippled by sustained bombing campaigns and constant shortages of equipment, could barely maintain reliable communication across its rapidly shrinking empire anymore. The statistics from that period confirm exactly what these women were realizing in real time. By late 1944, the United States operated over 400,000 telephones in military service alone, with civilian telephone lines numbering in the tens of millions across the country. In sharp contrast, the Reich maintained fewer than 2 million functioning telephone lines total, and many of those were concentrated in major cities that had already been reduced to smoking rubble. The prisoners were actually permitted to send letters home under Red Cross supervision, following international protocols. Some even dictated personal messages to American clerks who typed them out on clean white stationery. Ingrid recorded in her diary later that simply being able to touch a working telephone, to see a letter carried freely through proper postal channels, made her feel connected to civilization again. And yet this very freedom, this casual efficiency, represented everything they'd been taught to despise about democratic societies. The paradox cut sharply. Their captors' basic generosity somehow highlighted the complete bankruptcy of their own regime's grand promises. The sensory experience reinforced every lesson. The steady buzzing of switchboards operating continuously, the metallic snap of plugs being inserted into connection ports, the constant whirring sound of paper feeding through teletype machines. It created a symphony of pure efficiency that never stopped playing. The women gradually realized that this invisible infrastructure of communications represented as decisive a weapon as any tank or airplane. Wars weren't fought only with rifles and artillery shells. They were won through coordination and information flow. Hildegard, the nurse, later confessed during a post-war interview that she'd believed wholeheartedly that America was fundamentally disorganized, lazy, lacking any real discipline. Instead, what she witnessed proved that even their voices carried order and purpose. The war lived inside every telephone line, every radio wave. It was absolutely inescapable. But the Americans weren't showing off or trying to impress anyone. To them, this simply represented routine administrative work, nothing special or unusual. That very normalcy rattled the prisoners more than boastful displays ever could have. If this represented merely the background noise of a single prison camp located in Virginia, what must the full communication network of the entire United States sound like when operating at full capacity? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks, the weight of this paradox pressed heavily on their minds. They'd arrived as captured soldiers, expecting humiliation and harsh treatment. Instead, they were being given repeated glimpses of a system so vast in scale that it seemed almost casual in the exercise of its overwhelming power. For the Reich, secrecy had always functioned as protective armor. For America, transparency itself had become a source of strength. And soon, the proof of that strength would become even more visible and undeniable. Their next organized visit would take them directly into massive aircraft hangars, where the sheer scale of American production would shake the foundations of everything they'd been told about air superiority. The first sensory detail that struck them was the smell. Thick and heavy with oil, burning rubber, and high-octane gasoline. The scent was so overpowering it clung to their clothes and hair long after they finally left. The convoy of prisoner transport buses pulled up beside an enormous corrugated metal hangar, its massive doors yawning open like the mouth of some industrial giant. Inside that cavernous space, aircraft wings gleamed under rows of overhead lamps. Engines hung suspended from chains and cranes. Teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with a precision that looked almost choreographed. For the German women, most of them raised on constant tales of Luftwaffe superiority and German engineering excellence, the sight delivered yet another shock to their understanding. In their minds, German aircraft, the Messerschmitts, the Junkers, the Focke-Wulfs, still represented the finest machines in the sky. Yet here stood rows upon rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in some precious secret facility, but displayed openly by the dozens, perhaps even by the hundreds. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, assigned to escort the prisoner group, walked them casually down the hangar floor. He was a cheerful Irish-American with permanent grease stains on his sleeves and absolutely no sense that he was revealing anything particularly remarkable or secret. He slapped the metal flank of a B-24 Liberator bomber and announced that this particular aircraft could be completely replaced within 3 days if it happened to be lost in combat. 3 days, he repeated for emphasis. That's how fast American factories turned them out. Those words landed with more impact than any bomb could have delivered. 3 days to replace a heavy bomber. In Germany, aircraft factories had been systematically shattered by repeated Allied bombing raids. Spare parts had become desperately scarce commodities. Engines often took weeks to properly assemble, if the necessary components could even be found. Some planes were being completely cannibalized just to keep other aircraft flying. Here, the casual idea that a lost bomber represented simply a line item to be efficiently filled staggered their comprehension. The actual production numbers backed up O'Brien's casual boast completely. During 1944 alone, the United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft of various types, which exceeded Germany's total production for the entire war. At peak output, a new airplane rolled off American assembly lines somewhere in the country every 5 minutes around the clock. The contrast was obscene in its overwhelming scale. The sensory details made this revelation impossible to deny or dismiss. The rhythmic pounding of pneumatic rivet guns echoed constantly through the hangar like sustained machine gun fire, except instead of creating destruction, this noise built power. The air itself shimmered with heat, radiating from arc welding operations. Mechanics shouted instructions to one another over the constant roar of engines being test-fired. The concrete floor actually vibrated with the force of all this industry happening simultaneously. One of the prisoners, Lotta the radio operator, kept muttering repeatedly under her breath about how many planes she was seeing and how many more must be coming. Her voice trembled, but not from any fear of the guards. It was the sheer scale of realization washing over her about what this meant for the war's outcome. Hildegard, the nurse, confessed later in her personal journal that their leaders had told them America was fundamentally weak, unwilling to make real sacrifices. Yet here, sacrifice itself had become invisible because it was production rather than desperation driving everything forward. What struck the German women most profoundly was the complete casualness of it all. American workers joked with each other, shared cigarettes during breaks, and wiped sweat from their brows as though assembling heavy bombers was just another day's normal labor. To the Germans, who'd been told that every German worker was pressed to their absolute physical and mental limits, this relaxed ease felt genuinely unnerving. How could a people appearing so casual and comfortable produce such overwhelming military force? O'Brien, noticing their obvious awe, leaned closer to the group and said with a broad grin that they should see what was happening in Detroit if they really wanted to be impressed. He added that this particular hangar represented nothing but a tiny drop in the bucket. He chuckled and walked away, whistling, leaving the women standing in shocked silence. The paradox hung heavy and undeniable in the air around them. For the Reich, every single lost aircraft represented a national tragedy that couldn't easily be replaced. For America, it represented an inconvenience that would be remedied within days through simple industrial processes. That difference alone telegraphed the war's inevitable trajectory more clearly than any strategic analysis could. As the women were led back out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the ground-shaking roar of an engine test firing rattled the earth beneath their feet. That sound followed them onto the buses, vibrating in their bones like an ominous prophecy they couldn't escape, but their education in American power was far from finished. In the weeks that followed, they would be shown something even harder to deny or rationalize away. Photographs and detailed reports of American bombing campaigns that proved this industrial power wasn't merely theoretical. It was reaching deep into the heart of the Reich with devastating precision, destroying the very foundations of Germany's ability to continue fighting. 3 weeks passed inside the camp, creating a strange limbo of repeated routines, regular meals, thorough medical checkups, carefully monitored recreation periods. By this point, the German women no longer jumped nervously at the sound of American trucks rumbling past or the sharp bark of orders being given in English. But the moment that altered their fundamental understanding most profoundly didn't come from anything they witnessed in person. It arrived on paper. One crisp morning, they were gathered together in a small meeting hall where U.S. intelligence officers spread aerial photographs across long wooden tables. The images were black and white, technically crisp, and absolutely devastating in what they revealed. They showed German cities from high altitude, factories captured before and after bombing raids, rail junctions torn into twisted metal, synthetic fuel plants cracked open like fragile eggshells. An officer tapped one particular photo with his finger, his tone measured and clinical. He explained that this facility, the Leuna Works located near Merseburg, had produced most of Germany's aviation fuel, or rather, he corrected himself, it used to produce fuel. The image beside it showed nothing but twisted steel girders, shattered pipelines, and massive plumes of smoke frozen mid-rise by the camera shutter. The women leaned over these photographs in heavy silence, studying each one carefully. They'd been told repeatedly by Nazi broadcasts that Allied bombing campaigns were random, clumsy, and largely ineffective at causing real damage. Yet here spread before them was undeniable evidence of something precise, methodically calculated, and absolutely relentless. One photograph after another reinforced the same terrible point: a critical ball-bearing manufacturing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to complete rubble. Bridge spans across the Rhine River snapped like matchsticks. Rail switching yards in Cologne littered with overlapping bomb craters. A prisoner named Marta whispered almost to herself as though thinking aloud that this explained why their trains never ran on schedule anymore. The statistics from that period confirm what those photographs revealed. By the middle of 1944, Allied bomber forces were dropping more than 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every single month. Aircraft losses among the bomber crews ran high, sometimes devastatingly so, but American production capacity, those endless hangars full of bombers they'd already seen firsthand, made those losses sustainable in the long term. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace its fuel production facilities or its precision machinery once they were destroyed. Every single aerial photograph laid bare an uncomfortable truth. The Reich was slowly bleeding to death under skies it could no longer effectively control. The sensory impact hit hard, even through still images captured on paper. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters torn into blackened earth, examined the skeletal remains of factories that had once buzzed with productive life. One wrote in her diary afterward that she could almost smell the acrid smoke rising directly from the photographs themselves. What shook them most deeply was the casual, matter-of-fact way the American officers presented these images. This wasn't theatrical performance staged for the prisoners' benefit. This represented routine intelligence analysis, something these officers sifted through every single day as part of their normal duties. To the prisoners, each photograph felt like a dagger driven into their remaining hope. To the officers, it was just another standard report in a stack of thousands awaiting review. One officer explained without any particular malice or satisfaction that they didn't actually need to destroy absolutely everything. He said they just needed to eliminate the fuel supplies, the precision bearings, the transportation bridges. Once those critical nodes were gone, German armies literally couldn't move or fight effectively. His words were purely clinical in tone, but to the women listening, they carried the crushing weight of mathematical inevitability. Ingrid wrote in her journal afterward that it wasn't hatred that was defeating them. It was simple arithmetic, cold calculation applied with industrial precision. The paradox couldn't have been more stark. German propaganda had consistently painted America as reckless and chaotic in its approach to warfare. Yet what these women were seeing was cold, disciplined precision applied systematically. When the briefing session finally ended, the women walked slowly back to their barracks under a sky streaked with vapor contrails from training flights. For the first time since their capture, they felt as though even the very clouds overhead belonged to the enemy now. The Reich had told them the skies were theirs to command. The truth was being written in smoke and destruction above their homeland. But this new knowledge they'd gained carried with it a profound moral dilemma. Should they remain silent, protecting the comfortable illusion their country still desperately clung to? Or should they speak honestly, risking immediate accusations of betrayal and collaboration? That question would come to a decisive head with the unexpected arrival of a smuggled letter, one that would test both their remaining loyalty and the Americans' willingness to expose uncomfortable truths. The letter arrived on a grey afternoon, slipped quietly under the barracks door like contraband. It bore no official postal stamp, only a faint pencil scrawl across the envelope's face. Hildegard, the nurse, picked it up first, turning it over carefully in her hands. When she finally unfolded the thin paper inside, the other women crowded around her like moths, drawn irresistibly to flame. It came from another German prisoner of war camp, somewhere else in the United States, smuggled through an informal network of prisoners who'd managed to find ways to communicate between facilities. The message itself was short, written in hurried German script that looked rushed and desperate. It urged them to hold fast, claiming the Reich was pushing back successfully on all fronts. It mentioned new weapons that would soon change the entire war. It warned them not to believe anything the Americans showed them. It insisted that final victory remained near. The words echoed the same promises they'd all heard before their capture, the same reassurances broadcast endlessly. Yet now, after everything they'd witnessed in the hangar and in those devastating photographs, these sentences rang completely hollow. The letter's underlying tone of desperation spoke far louder than its surface bravado. Lotta, the radio operator, slowly shook her head. She said quietly that if Germany were actually winning, nobody would need to write letters like this. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat against the table, her expression troubled. She pointed out that this was still what their families back home were being told, what everyone in Germany still believed. She asked what would happen if their loved ones kept believing these lies while they, the prisoners, now knew something entirely different. The tension in that cramped barracks room thickened noticeably. Their lives in camp had already become shaped by uncomfortable paradoxes. They were being treated far better by their captors than their own regime had ever treated them. They were fed regularly while their families slowly starved. They were shown truths that directly contradicted the Reich's ironclad propaganda. Now, this smuggled letter threatened to drag them back into the comfortable shadows of blind belief. That same evening, an American lieutenant, one of the officers who'd shown them the bombing photographs earlier, addressed the women directly. He held the intercepted letter in his hand, making it clear they'd known about it all along. Speaking in halting but serviceable German, he told them they didn't have to believe him or trust anything he said. But he wanted them to know something important. America didn't show them lies because they didn't need to rely on deception. He then laid out a fresh set of aerial photographs on the nearest table. These images were even more recent than the previous batch. Rail depots in Frankfurt reduced to useless rubble. Massive columns of dark smoke from Hamburg that seemed to stretch upward into the sky forever. The contrast between that smuggled letter's desperate reassurances and these stark photographic images couldn't possibly have been sharper or more painful. For the first time since arriving, one of the prisoners, a woman named Greta, who'd remained almost completely silent for weeks, spoke up firmly. She asked if Germany truly possessed such powerful new weapons as the letter claimed. Why weren't they stopping this destruction? She tapped the photograph with a trembling finger, her voice breaking slightly. The silence that followed her question felt heavier than any guard's shouted command. That night, very few among them managed to sleep. The sound of distant engines from a nearby pilot training airfield rolled through the darkness like an unending reminder. Their dreams filled with smoke, collapsing factories, and the nagging, persistent thought that perhaps loyalty had become nothing more than a habit born from years of fear. The letter had intended to steal their faith and commitment. Instead, it cracked their resolve even further. The question of what to believe no longer carried any easy or comfortable answer. And in the weeks ahead, as American guards began permitting more controlled visits into nearby local towns, the contrast between propaganda's promises and observed reality would deepen until denial was no longer psychologically possible. Spring arrived in 1945, bringing with it a strange, heavy silence. The barracks that had once buzzed constantly with rumors and hushed disbelief grew quieter with each passing day. Newspapers, deliberately left in common areas by American officers who wanted the truth seen, announced the fall of one German city after another: Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt. Each bold headline represented another nail being driven into the coffin of any remaining certainty. By April, whispers reached even these isolated German women prisoners. The Führer was dead. The Reich, which had claimed so confidently it would last 1,000 years, had collapsed in barely 12. The women sat on their wooden bunks, staring at one another in numb silence, completely unable to reconcile the world they'd been raised in with the world they now saw crumbling into ash and defeat. Ingrid wrote in her diary during those final days that they'd come to America as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule all of Europe. Now she could see clearly that they'd been nothing but children, fed elaborate stories and comforting lies, while America had been steadily building a world that existed beyond their comprehension. The U.S. Army began making preparations for the prisoners' eventual repatriation. The women received clean uniforms, underwent final medical examinations, and were given rations for the ocean voyage back home. Some wept openly at the thought of seeing family members again after so long. Others felt genuine fear about what might await them in a defeated, starving Germany. For all of them, the journey carried a haunting paradox they couldn't escape. They were leaving behind comfort and order in the land of their enemy, returning to chaos and ruin in their own homeland. Before departure, a Red Cross officer presented Ingrid with an unusual decision. She could carry a message home, not a personal letter to family, but an official report to German authorities. Washington had debated the risks involved. Would her words simply be dismissed as enemy propaganda, or could they potentially serve as proof of the utter futility of continued resistance? Ingrid's account was deliberately brief but completely unflinching. She wrote that America's strength was not fabricated lies. It existed everywhere throughout their society, in their machines, their factories, their abundant food supplies, their fundamental unity of purpose. To continue fighting this war represented nothing but pure madness. When the ship carrying these women finally docked in Bremerhaven, her report was sent up through the proper chain of command. The reaction proved entirely predictable. German officers dismissed it outright, labeling Ingrid either a traitor who'd sold out or a gullible woman who'd been seduced by American trickery and propaganda. The truth she'd witnessed was simply too large, too overwhelming to fit into their shrinking, desperate ideology. But for the women themselves, the truth couldn't be erased or denied regardless of what officials claimed. They had seen aircraft rolling off assembly lines faster than they could possibly be destroyed in combat. They'd eaten meals more abundant than their own families could dream about. They'd walked through streets where children played freely without constant fear of air raids. What they carried back inside their heads was not just fading memory, but direct lived comparison, a stark contradiction to everything the Reich had promised them. Years later, some of these women would tell their children and grandchildren about that surreal journey to America during the final year of the war. They didn't speak about it with shame or as a story of humiliation. They described it as an awakening, an opening of eyes that had been deliberately kept shut. They recalled with perfect clarity the ringing clang of shipyard hammers, the endless rows of military vehicles, the casual freedom of speech they'd overheard in every cafe and on every street corner. These were impressions that no photograph or speech could ever erase from memory. They had arrived as prisoners of a regime that called itself invincible and destined for greatness. They departed as witnesses to that regime's fundamental delusion. In the end, what unsettled them most wasn't America's bombs or its military might. It was America's abundance, its seemingly relentless capacity to create and produce, its fundamental refusal to bow before scarcity or hardship. This wasn't clever propaganda designed to fool them. This was simply reality, observed directly and impossible to explain away. They had come believing themselves part of a conquering force. They left as unwilling students who'd received an education they never expected. In the final analysis, America's greatest weapon proved to be not its impressive arsenal, but its living proof that freedom, when properly matched with industrial capacity and unified will, could outbuild and outlast any tyranny, no matter how confident or ruthless it believed itself to be.